The other day, a friend of mine asked me if I could make some small cam things to use as clamps for some project he's working on. And unfortunately, my shop is currently all packed up in a storage unit, so I couldn't do that, but I do have a 3D printer, and so I was able to make him these clamps, and I thought this was a sort of thing that could be useful for others who might need a similar sort of thing. It's an interesting process, I think. So anyway, I thought I would show how I go about doing this anyway. So let's dive in. Here I've got a fresh screen, fresh model. My default template is set up for fractional units, but in this case, because I want to work on a very small object and I want a large number of segments in curves and that sort of thing, I'm going to change the units to decimal, and I'm going to work in meters. Note, length snapping is disabled, and we'll leave it at that. And to get me something started here, I'm going to draw a circle at the center, and I'm going to work basically around the origin for this model. And by default, the number of sides is 24, and for this hole I could leave it at 24, but I'm going to run it up to make it a smoother hole. So I'm going to use 96. I always work in some multiple of 12 for the number of sides on circles or arcs, because that's evenly divisible by 2, 3, 4, and 6. So that tends to be kind of nice. It doesn't really matter in this particular case, but that's just my standard. So I want a clearance hole in the center of my cam for a 1/4 screw. So I'm going to use 0.1285 as the radius. And what I'm doing here is I'm entering my dimensions as if inches were meters. And later, because of the way my slicer works, I'm going to have to scale the model. But I don't have to think in millimeters now. I can do that later. All right, so I've got a circle. We'll leave that there for the moment. And then from the Curve Maker tool set, I'm going to use an Archimedes spiral. Could use one of the other ones, I guess, if you want. But I'm going to click at the origin, and I'm going to drag out this direction. And you can see it's drawing a nice spiral. I'm going to set the radius, the first radius, at 1.5. So that's 1.5 inches out to that point there. And then I'm going to come in here, set the second radius to 1. So I've got a 1/2 inch from here to here. And my turns, I'm going to let that be from 0. And by the way, if you look at the lower right corner, you can see the measurements window is showing the input for this. So 0 turns, and by default it wants to do 2 turns, but I only need 1. So type 1. Then it goes back to that first radius, and we could change that, but I don't need to in this case. And the second one. And then the sides per turn, by default, is 36. I want this to be small, smooth. So I'm going to make that 96 as well. 96 I found is plenty for most 3D printed stuff and for other things. It gives me an option to put in a height, but I don't want to change the height. I want this thing to be flat. And I'm going to leave this as a counterclockwise, or I'm sorry, clockwise direction for the turn. So it's going from largest to smallest in the clockwise direction. If I were to type a 1 here, it would flip this around and go the other direction. But for what my friend needs, clockwise will work. So I can just, and we can step through these. I just keep hitting the enter key until I get back, in this case, to the clockwise question again, and I'll type 0 and leave it at that. So now I'm done with that, and I'll just hit the space bar to go back to the select tool. And it's created that spiral as a group. I actually don't want it to be a group, so I'm going to go ahead and explode that. You can see there's no face there, but there will be as soon as I connect the ends here. And now I can erase the center there to leave myself a hole. And I'm going to get rid of the sharp corners. I'm not going to leave any sharp corners on this thing. So let's see, we'll use the arc tool, and I'm going to set the number of sides to 24. And I think I'm just eyeballing this. It's not terribly critical in this case, but I'm going to go from the midpoint of that segment on the curve. I'm going to drag out here until I get a magenta inference, which means I'm tangent to both the first edge and the second, and I can double click. And then I'm going to do the same sort of thing here. Let's start down here and see if we are all right there. There we go. And then we'll get the eraser and we'll erase those edges and those. And so I think that'll work. Now my friend only wanted the thickness of this thing to be 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to bring this up 0.25. And then it doesn't really need to be that thick across the entire width. So what I'm going to do, or across the entire surface, I'm going to get the offset tool, keyboard shortcut for that. I'm going to come in here, let's come in 0.125, so that's 1/8 of an inch. And we'll just leave that like that. And then I'm going to push that down 1/8 of an inch. And I think that will work for the general shape. I'm going to soften edges, so just triple click on that and choose soften, and that just kind of cleans up all of that. Doesn't really matter because those are cosmetic in this particular case. The other thing that I'm going to do, because again we don't really need an awful lot of stuff here in the middle of this, I'm going to use offset on that outer spiral. I'm going to come in here, let's come in about, well, let's see what 1/2 inch looks like. Let's go 3/8. All right. Neat thing is we can kind of play this experiment. All right, so now I've got that curve, and I'll do it from the menu, edit, cut. And then I'm going to select all of the cam. I'm going to go ahead and create a component, and we'll call it okay. Then I'm going to use edit, paste in place to put that path in there. That's going to be a path actually. And I'm going to cut this back, let's go to that end point there. Make that a little bit shorter. So I'll just select that and delete it and that. And what I'm going to do is use that as a path for placing some circles to use as holes. So I'm going to just draw a circle, and let's make it, I don't know, 3/16. Maybe not quite that big. Let's make it so it's 1/4 inch in diameter. Now, change my mind. I'm going back to the 16ths. Indecisive, I guess. All right, I'm going to pull that up and make it the same height for now as the lowered face on the cam, and just pull it down a little bit here. I'm going to triple click on that to select it all. I'm going to make that a component. This one doesn't really need a name because it's temporary, but I want to set the component's axes at the center of the top. There we go. All right. So I'm going to use this to create a sort of a drill to cut some holes in this cam. And I'm going to use an extension called Path Copy. I'll have links to all of these in extensions I'm using in the body of the text, the blog text. So the first thing it wants me to do is select the path. Then it wants me to select the component. And by default, I'm not sure why it's set this way, but it's got a distance between the cylinders of a little over 3 meters. Let's see what we get if we go to like 1/2 meter. I think that'll work. We can change our mind here if we wanted, you know, we could do 0.6 or 0.7, but 0.5 I think works fine. Get me some holes there. So now I don't need that path or that copy of the component anymore. These, actually, let's do this while I'm here. I'm going to go ahead and just pull the faces up on those, or the top of that up, so it cuts through. But now I'm going to explode those. This is kind of one of the rare times I explode components. And I'm going to make a new component, and this one I don't care about where the component's axes are, but that's just one component now made up of all of these cylinders, and you can see in entity info that it shows as a solid component, and my cam is also a solid. So now I'm going to use, actually I'll bring it out here, I'm going to use the difference tool from Bool Tools 2, and I'm going to click on the cam and then on my collection of cylinders, my drills, and we wait a moment, and now I've got holes. All right, and so let's go ahead and we'll just stick that back over here where it lives. Come on, you. There we are. All right, this is still a solid component. Now, I had mentioned early on that I was going to have to scale this thing, and the reason for that is the slicer that I have for my 3D printer only accepts millimeters for units, but I've modeled this in inches. So if I select this right now and look at the dimensions, you can see that it shows it's, well, it's 0.25 meters tall. If I were to import this into the slicer the way it is, it'd end up being 0.25 millimeters tall, and I don't want that. That's just barely thicker than what my printer will do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a line. I'm going to make it 1 inch long, or 1 meter long. Then I'm going to use the tape measure tool. And I'm going to click on one endpoint, click on the other endpoint. I'm going to type 25.4 because there's 25.4 millimeters in an inch. And I'm going to say I want to resize this, yes. And we'll back out here where we can see this. We don't need that line anymore, so we delete it. I'm going to scale the definition of the component because I scaled this thing without having the component open for editing. SketchUp still is recording it as the smaller version, so we'll do that. And now I'm ready to export. So we'll go to File, Export, 3D Model, and we're going to go to the desktop and put it there, and I'm going to call this cam. I've got the .stl file format selected. Under Options, I've got it set so it'll select only the current selection. In this case, since there's nothing else that can be unticked. And then the STL units. STL files are really not really unitless, but you want this to match whatever your modeling units are. So I could use model units. I generally, because all of my 3D printing is done with units set to meters, I just leave it set at meters. And then click Export, and that's done. So the next thing will be to go into the slicer. All right, so here we are in the slicer, and I'm going to open the file. There it is. And you can see that it shows up now as 6.3 millimeters thick, which is exactly what I want. And let's see, I think that we'll go through our settings here. I'm not going to go a lot into the settings that I'm making. I do want to check infill density. I don't think it needs to have 45%. Let's do 30%. And I think we'll be good there. Print speed, support. Don't need anything for build plate adhesion. I found that wiping my build plate with isopropyl alcohol before I start a print is plenty. Sometimes it makes things even hard to get off. And I don't seem to need any sort of brim or skirt or anything. So we'll slice that. 1 hour and 4 minutes and 22 cents. Can't hardly beat that. I'm not sure you could make this out of any sort of wood for 22 cents. Anyway, we'll do a preview just because I like to see the preview. And we'll export that, and then we'll print it. So there we go. And now we're off to the printer. And so here's the final printed cam, ready to deliver to my friend. And hopefully it'll suit his needs. Anyway, hopefully there was something there you can take away. Give it a shot, and if you've got any questions, by all means, drop me a note.